a bipedal primate of sorts. Everything kind of hit home towards the end of June. I think it was a Sunday. I was down at Lavers Hill. I've got a friend that's got a private wildlife sanctuary down there. I was acquiring a couple of bettongs, which are rabbit-sized wallabies, and I was with my partner, Susanna. She was pregnant with our twin boys. Just on a whim on the way home, it was late in the afternoon, getting towards 4 o'clock, I decided to drive down to Beauchamp Falls, which is basically just around the corner, so to speak, in Beach Forest, which is still in the Otways, and it's just cool temperate forest, and it's a beautiful place to go, and I thought we'll just pop down there and just go for a little walk. After 4 o'clock in the afternoon, misty rain around 10 degrees, Susanna got out of the car and we walked to the start of the walk that takes you to the falls. I proceeded to go ahead of her and she was behind me taking photos of mushrooms. And I was probably 150, 200 metres ahead of her, waiting for her to sort of make her way down to me. Now when I go in the bush I'm usually very quiet because I like to catch things out and wombats and all the rest of it, and anything I can see, and sort of, that's just what I do. And I was just either in the wrong place at the wrong time or the right place at the right time. Basically, I'd headed down, I'm not sure exactly how far away from Susanna I was, but it was a fair distance, heading down towards the falls, and it's basically a tree fern lined track with Dixonia antarctic, which is the soft tree ferns, which are about 6 or 7 feet high on either side, like a corridor and avenue, as you're walking down this very narrow trackway that takes you down to the falls. And subsequently I heard a noise, which at the time I thought was one of three things: a deer, wombat, or a kangaroo. I've heard people use the word guttural. It was a cough of sorts. It was very low and deep and powerful, similar to what koalas will make. So I thought it may have been a koala because there's a lot down that area. And I turned off the track and I went into the forest. I stepped within about 2 or 3 feet, probably 4 at the most, so it was right adjacent to the actual track, looking around at the ground, when something caught my eye ahead of me, probably about 12 or so metres ahead of me in a straight line. And in amongst some saplings was a very large, dark, browny black figure, which at first your sort of mind sort of tries to make sense of what you're looking at. I thought it was a large deer, and I thought it was browsing, and it was a very large deer. So I'm standing there looking at this thing. This thing stood up, was facing me, and my whole world changed right there, right then. I've got my arms, the hairs of my arms are standing up right now. Yeah. This thing was immense. It was absolutely huge. It stood there looking at me for what felt like, and you hear people say this all the time, like a lifetime. I was trying to take it all in. Basically, I was looking at a large bipedal primate of sorts, something I never expected to see. It completely threw me off guard. I'm about 5'7" and about 60-something kilos. This thing was huge, and looking straight at me, I was looking straight back at it. From that distance, I could pretty much see all of it down to around about its ankles. There's a lot of bracken fern and small shrubs and sapling trees in the way, but I got a pretty good view. Basically, we stood looking at each other for what felt like a lifetime, but it was probably a matter of 30 seconds to a minute, if that. It subsequently turned to its our left and headed straight towards a pine plantation. Now, I sort of gathered myself and was humming and hawing whether I should run back to the car or continue and just get a better look. So I waited till it was sort of out of sight, because it had to brush through all the small shrubs and saplings to get away from where I could see it out of my line of view. I went back onto the track, I ran up to where it was, went back into the forest where it had been standing, and now I was watching it leave the area. And I got another good look at it it was probably about 20 metres away at that stage. It was moving it was swimming through the forest basically. It was using its hands on either side of its body to move the saplings out of the way. It basically got to just before there's a fire trail between the forest and the actual pine plantation. It got to the verge of that, turned around, sort of pivoted, sort of turned with its hip. It didn't sort of do it with its neck or anything, or it didn't have a neck. It sort of just turned its body around, faced me again, as if to say, "What are you doing?" That's when I got the fear in me, and I sort of backed out of there and I ran back to Susanna. That was the start of everything, basically. That sort of changed my whole look at the forest and the way that I interact with animals, and I've never felt the same way about the Australian bush ever again. And the first thing I did was get on Google and basically type in Australian Bigfoot and Bigfoot sightings in Australia, and that led me to finding out about Dean and everything. And losing a lot of friends and making a lot of new ones. So, yeah, just basically that changed my whole life. I'll never look at the Australian bush the same way ever again, and I don't think I'll ever be the same person I was back then.
Okay, so...
Actually, probably happier not knowing about it. Basically, it's called Beauchamp Falls. There's quite a few falls that are down in the Otways, and this was one of them that I hadn't been to before. It's basically surrounded by pastoral farmland and logging sort of pine plantations, and then that backs onto the forest, which is this cool temperate forest. You've got mountain ash, various types of tree ferns, and it's quite beautiful and quite remote as well.
And you headed in the direction of the sound?
I was already heading towards the falls. If I had not heard this, I would have walked within feet of it and not even probably known, because it wasn't that far off the actual track. When I walked into the forest, it was ahead of me, but it was basically at the same sort of point. If it took me about 3 or 4, well, probably about 3 to 4 feet from the track into the forest in a straight line ahead in front of me, if I'd gone down the track, I would have walked right past it, and it would have been again 3 or 4 feet away from me if I just walked right past it.
So you move towards the sound and you move into the forest, which is pretty dense?
Yes, it is, yes. There was a large eucalypt that had fallen down and at some stage had been sawn in half. This was now covered in tree ferns and other ferns that were growing all over it, and moss. There was small bracken fern, and then interspersed with all this was just young sapling trees that had come up. So there was a partial line of sight that was clear until you got to where the animal was standing, and that was sort of in amongst saplings and tree ferns.
You move off the track and you move towards the sound.
That's right.
Kind of focused, I guess, on what's ahead of you, and then
That's right. I was basically looking at the ground, and it wasn't until I saw movement out of the corner of my eye ahead of me that I sort of stopped and looked up. And I didn't want to startle whatever it was. The only thing my mind could make up at the time was it was a deer that I was looking at. Because of the size of it, it was just huge. It was just massive.
The distance from you to this thing, when you look up and you get this movement, what was the distance between from
roughly? Now I keep large pythons, so I've got to be good with how many feet they are. I would say maybe around the 30 plus foot. So what's that, sort of over 10 to 12 metres at least.
And was it on the same level as you, or down slope or up slope?
Ground all the way.
Okay, so it's level. Between you and it is a lot of brush, or...
Yeah, I'd say basically bracken fern up to about, now I'm 5'7", bracken fern up to about my knees, and it was definitely up to its ankles. Small saplings that are a bit thicker than a broom handle, all over the place. They're probably about 13, 14 foot high, maybe a little bit taller.
But what you're sort of suggesting is it was generally open between you and it, apart from these...
There was a definite open space of just basically bracken fern and the odd tree fern. I had a clear line of sight. Where I was standing, I was looking directly to it. So there was probably maybe 6 or 7 feet in front of it was just these small saplings that it was amongst. And it, from the look of it, was looking at the ground at the time. I got a fairly good look.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about that.
Yeah.
So you notice the movement, you look up, and this thing is facing directly at you or side?
No, it was looking at the ground. It was leaning forward, looking at the ground. That's why I couldn't make out what exactly, if I was looking at the back of a deer. Sometimes a deer will rear up on their back legs and they'll forage. But I didn't see any of the attributes of a deer. I didn't see the long spindly legs or anything like that, even though they've got a bulky body. The hair was different. The overall sort of shape of it was just big, sort of stood and corrected its posture. I couldn't exactly tell what I was looking at.
Looking at the ground, and then what? It straightened up and looked at you?
Straightened up and was aware that I was looking at it, and it was aware of me at this stage, and that's when it just stared at me.
If you're looking at this thing, I want to ask some questions just about what it looked like. Are you looking at a big, solid kind of person? Is that the shape of the thing you're looking at?
Superficially, yes, but at the same time, no. I've heard people say gorillas and this and this. Definitely primate attributes. At the same time, superficially with the length of the arms, and I didn't get a good look at the hands because the hands were facing back towards behind it. It had its hands by its side, but they were facing backwards.
Was it muscly or was it...
Bigger than any bodybuilder I've ever seen. His reports and, saying no neck. It had no visible neck. The muscles from the sides came out at least 2.5 feet on either side, giving it at least a 4-foot shoulder. It was huge. The head wasn't domed. It was more rounded. It had a flat face, dark, deep-set eyes, The nose, from what I could see, I probably got a better view when it walked away from me, and I went up to where it was standing, and I was standing where it had been, and now it was probably about 20 metres or so just going through the forest. When it turned around, there was a bit of an opening, if that makes any sense, and I got a better look at its face that time. It was a bit more, where we were was in the forest canopy, so basically there's tree ferns on either side. It was kind of quite dull in that particular area. When I got to where it had been standing and now it's heading towards the fire trail, it was a bit lighter in that particular area, so I definitely got to see its facial features a lot better. Now, I've heard this before and I have to agree with it. It looked like it had an Aboriginal type nose, not a gorilla nose by any means. It was very flat in the face. It was almost like someone had hit it in the face with a frying pan. It was just basically straight down. The eyebrow region, the brow ridge and everything was protruding. I didn't get a good look at its forehead because it was covered in hair. The eyes were dark and black. The nose was basically squashed into the face. It sort of came out a little bit, but was generally squashed into the face, and it had a very large mouth, very large.
But I want to go back to when it was face onto you. So This thing appeared to be hairy everywhere?
Oh, yes, yeah. It was covered from what I could see, head to toe.
What was the colour of the hair that you were looking at?
It was a dark chocolatey brown, blacky colour. Probably about, I'd say, 3 to 4 inches at least all over. Very uniform, except for the head and basically under the arms. When it moved and it was going through the forest and it was basically pushing saplings, not breaking them, but just moving them out of the way. So when it put its arms down, and the arms never came up higher than its waist, they were always down, it sort of just pushed them out of its way as it was going forward. It definitely had at least 7 to 8 inch hair underneath the arms, from probably just above the elbow down to just before the wrist, and I clearly saw that. The rest of the hair was pretty much the same length all over from what I could tell. It was a bit matted and mangly around the shoulder region. It had facial hair, but it didn't look like it had a beard per se. The hair on the head was different to, well, the head on the hair on the shoulders was different in texture to the hair on the rest of the body. It sort of was a lot longer looking, but as soon as it got to where the shoulders mingled and the rest of the torso, it became sort of a uniform, sort of 3 to 4 inches. Pretty much, there was no bald spots, nothing like that. I couldn't see nipples or anything like that on the chest, not like you see with a gorilla. It was definitely covered from head to toe. And I didn't get to see the hands because when he was staying there, he had his hands facing backwards, and then when he was moving through the forest, I was looking at the back of him. So I was looking at the shoulders, the back of the head, basically the buttocks, which had quite a large bottom, and like I said, at least on each arm it was about 2.5 feet, which, you know, around about that, so massive shoulders, absolutely huge.
How tall do you think this thing was?
Tree ferns that it was standing adjacent to were around the 6 to 7 foot mark. This thing was towering over them. Without going back with the tape measure and all the rest of it, I'd have to say it was 8 foot tall, at least 8 foot tall.
When you're looking at this thing, was this thing muscled?
Yes, very much so. It wasn't lanky, it wasn't skinny, it was extremely well built.
Did you get any sense that this thing could have been someone in a suit?
No. I've seen, there's that Rick Dyer person going around the internet and he's done a few hoaxes and whatnot, and I've seen other people in sort of Chewbacca type costumes and whatnot. There is no way. I've seen the Patterson film from America that was shot in '67. It didn't look quite like that, but at the same time, it was real. There was no way. I mean, we were the only ones down there. It backs onto basically its state forest, and then it backs onto this logging coop with all this Pinus radiata plantation, which is quite thick, and it just headed straight for that. There was no sagginess or anything like that. You could definitely see muscle definition. I could see its muscles moving in its legs when it had the back towards me. I was standing there looking at it. It was breathing in and out, and there's just, I mean, I've seen movies in Hollywood and whatnot, and there's just no way. I mean, I haven't seen a costume yet that looks real. This was no doubt a real flesh and blood animal. Last time I weighed myself was about 67 kilos, but I would have to say this thing was over 200 kilos. I couldn't give a sort of estimate on exactly what it did weigh, like, you know, right in the ballpark figure, but over 200, and it just looked solid. It didn't look fat. It just looked very, very muscular and well built. These saplings, I could lean on, with two hands, I could push one the way it was just doing with its fingers. I mean, there was no effort. It was just no effort at all. It just had a hand on either side of its body and just basically was brushing them past, making a corridor for itself. And as it would go through, these trees would just bounce back to the position they were in. It didn't snap them in half. It didn't do any of that sort of behaviour. It just basically walked straight and was just swimming through the trees. Its fingers came back to the side, facing me, and basically just pushed them out of the way, and they'd just go back to the original position. If I was to do the same thing, I'd have to use my whole sort of two hands just to do the same thing.
This thing is looking at you directly.
Yes.
Got a sense of the face, but perhaps a bit better later on when it was moving off. Yeah, and you mentioned the word primate a few times, but did you think you were looking at an ape or a person? Like, was there any sense of humanness in this thing?
Yeah, basically, I would say a cross between the two. Didn't look like a gorilla and it didn't look like a man. It definitely looked like a mismatch between two. It had attributes of a human, but at the same time, I mean, I've been to the zoo numerous times with my children, and they've got the glass wall where you can stand basically right side by side with the gorillas, and you'd have to get two and a bit gorillas on top of one another to even come close to this thing. But a gorilla looks like a gorilla. There's no question. This had an oddly strange face in the sense that it was like if you were basically to get a human and a primate and sort of mix them together. A great ape. The eyes were incredibly large, deep set. There was a brow ridge. When I first was looking at it, that's what really struck me was the eyes. It had very large, dark eyes. I couldn't see any whites or anything like that. It had a very blank expression on its face. Its mouth was very large. Its nose wasn't too big, but at the same time, it didn't have a typical sort of orangutan or gorilla nose. It definitely had a human sort of looking nose.
You mentioned you saw arms. Were they short arms?
No, they were long. Very, very large and very long. I've heard this so many times, but they were down around the knees, but at the same time he had his arms down beside himself with them facing back. So his hands were facing behind himself. He didn't have his fingers splayed or anything like that, but they were definitely... I was trying to take everything in the short amount of time that I got to get a good look, and at the same time I was in complete and utter shock.
You mentioned the length of time. So you move off, you notice the movement, and then you see it. It moved off. Did you lose track of it, and then you moved up and you saw it again, or what was the sequence?
In my line of vision, there was a eucalyptus, a large mountain gum or mountain ash that had fallen down, and subsequently it must have gone across the track, and it's been chainsawed in half into sections. And that's where there was a bit of a clearing, and that's where all the bracken ferns had shot up. It was basically in my line of sight, straight ahead of me. When it turned, and it just abruptly turned, there was no dramatics. It wasn't it was basically, we're looking at one another. I don't think it was sizing me up. I think it was more or less shocked that I was standing there, and I was more or less shocked that it was standing opposite me. I was the one that felt like I didn't belong there, and the first time in my whole life I've been in the forest and felt like I didn't belong. And basically it abruptly turned towards the logging coop, or this pine plantation, and walked basically in a single file straight through the bush. It didn't run off, but it definitely was quick-paced. There was no hesitation. It just moved. When it was sort of out of my line, I could still see it, but it was basically obscured by all the trees. I had to then, the quickest way to get to where it was standing was to go back onto the track that leads to the falls, run down to where it was, and then go back through the tree ferns, which are large tree ferns at the side of the track on either side. And then I was standing probably a few feet in again where it had been. There was no disturbance in the ground or anything like that. I don't know what it was doing where it was standing, but something had caught its attention. Basically, that's when it was in a clear line of sight now, heading into the pine plantation.
How long would you say you actually had it under observation?
Well, at least 30 seconds to maybe just under a minute when I was first standing there and I was looking at it. And then basically, when it started to move off, then I had to get back onto the track, run up to the position where it was standing, and that's when I got another probably minute or so viewing of it basically leaving the area. That's when it got to probably about 20 metres away from me then. That's when it turned around, just sort of gave me this look like, don't even think about coming any closer, and that put the wind up me. The look I got wasn't dissimilar to the look that it was giving me the whole time when I was staying there, the first part, but I got this feeling like, don't. And basically I took 3 steps back, turned around, and ran back up the track. When I got to Susanna, I was white as a ghost.
That's interesting. In the first bit you were saying you just got a blank look, but then you actually definitely got a...
Oh yeah, I definitely got... It was... there was no expression, you know. Basically it was just a very blank sort of surprised look. But then again, the eyes were so dark and the face was just not... It was rigid. It wasn't doing anything. It didn't grimace. It just basically was just looking at me, just intently looking at me. When I went up to where I'd been standing and it was away from me, and it obviously knew at this stage that I was behind it again, that's when it turned around, and that's when I got a better look at the face. And the look I got then was a different look. If it was still without expression, but at the same time, I just got this feeling like, don't take another step closer.
Can I ask why? This just one thing interests me. You mentioned at the beginning where you were quite close and you have a full face on, but you're saying that later, when it was further away, you got a better view of the face. I don't understand why.
Well, what happened is I was under the canopy of the tree ferns and all the beech forest and all the rest of it around me. When it walked towards the clearing, there's an open bit of clearing, which is the fire trail between the actual forest and the actual pine plantation. The sun and everything, even though it wasn't sunny, the light comes in and basically lights up the area a lot more. So where we were standing, it was quite dark and dim. When it had gone up to this point, before it actually got into the pine plantation, it was a lot more exposed in that particular area. You could actually see the clouds and everything in the sky above. Where we were standing originally, it was basically all just tree cover. So it was kind of dark and damp, and because of that time of afternoon, it was harder to see because of the colour of his features and everything. It was a lot harder to see. Okay. When he went into this open sort of area where the sun, you know, where the sky was coming in, you could definitely see a lot more than I could when he was just right in front of me. Okay. Just the position of when he turned his body and looked, and it was definitely, I didn't get a feeling or an impression that it was female. It was definitely a boy. I wasn't able to see any sort of genitalia or anything like that, but I definitely got the feeling that it was a male, and that just this, the only way to describe it is an overwhelming sense of fear, basically, which I didn't have to begin with. I was just more surprised and shocked, and I didn't really know, you know, my brain was racing at 100 miles a minute, but when it turned around, that was definitely, that put the wind up me. Yeah, it took me quite some time to even go back there. I've got a friend in America that was interested in what happened, and I thought I'll go back and I'll make a little video of where it happened and whatnot. And the whole time I was there, my heart was racing. The hair was standing up on my arms. I couldn't get in and out of the area fast enough. And to this day, I flatly sort of refuse to go back down there just because of what happened. And even when I go to any forest now, I'm always looking around and just checking everything out and listening a lot more intently. And before I used to be quite brazen and just go in the bush and I was looking for things, and I thought I was the sort of, you know, the top bloke in the bush, but now I know that I'm not. And it's changed everything for me as far as that's concerned. But basically, it was taking one step in front of the other in a straight line with its arms either side, down by its side, and they were basically being used to move the saplings out of the way, making a path in front of it as it went. And as it did so, like it had done it a million times before. The hands came out, moved the saplings bend out of the way, it would take another step, the saplings would fall back in place again. So basically, it was not walking like we walk. We tend to walk sort of 1 foot, you know, adjacent to the other on an angle. He was walking 1 foot dead in front of the other foot as he was walking, and very long, powerful steps. He was clearing a lot of ground as he made each and every step. Whereas, you know, I would take quite a few frequent steps just to make one of his steps. Just amazing. Just basically, I was, even now, just reliving it now, just thinking about it in my head, it was just complete shock and awe, and disbelief of what I was actually seeing and trying to take it all in. There was no way it was a man in a suit, just no way. A costume would get caught up in the debris and all the rest of it, and then the shrubs, and he was just pounding, just pushing through. And I mean, I've just had to relive this over and over. I had nightmares about it, trouble sleeping, basically just going over and over and over in my head, basically what happened that day. And like I said, it took me a couple of years to just get back down there, and even going back down there just makes it all come back again.
I can imagine. Now, sort of as you're looking at this thing, you mentioned sort of the shape of the head.
Yep.
You mentioned I think you said that it didn't appear to have kind of a neck. It was kind of like quite solid.
Oh, yeah, it was all muscular were around. I've heard this said time and time and time again. It was like the head was plonked straight on the shoulders. The head was almost, if you get an egg and cut it in half and basically sit it straight down like that, there was no visible neck. The shoulders, the trapezius muscles and everything came straight up from where its ears would be, and then right across. It was very square on the shoulders, but the body did taper down. Even though it was very solid and barrel-chested, it did taper down towards the hips. So it wasn't like a brick with legs, so to speak. It did definitely taper down towards its hips. But the arms were massive. Because of my long hair, I've got long blonde hair. And when we were looking at one another, I almost sort of looked back and wonder, was it sort of trying to work out what I was? Because it was definitely taking me in. And I was definitely, at the same time, no threat. Absolutely no threat.
Yeah.
This guy was huge.
You mentioned when you're talking about the face, when I think of a gorilla, I think of an animal that's got a definite muzzle.
No muzzle. No. It was pancake. It was flat. It had large protruding lips. It had very deep, dark lips, quite a large mouth, but the face, generally speaking, was quite flat.
In the face, was it all hairy, or was there skin on the face?
There was hair covering right up to about, basically, its mouth was left. You could see its mouth. It didn't have a beard, or what I would call a beard, but it definitely had facial hair going up to just below the eyes and around the eyes. And then basically a little bit of what you'd call a fringe, I guess. And then you could see some skin showing, which was dark skin, underneath that going up above the forehead. But the only part that wasn't covered with hair